The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the bones of Blackwood, a remote outpost huddled against the vast, unforgiving expanse of the northern wilderness. For Alara, it was more than just the bite of the wind or the frost that grew on the inside of her window pane. It was a cold that lived inside her skin, a permanent chill she had carried for 10 of her 19 years. It was the cold of hunger, the gnawing emptiness that was never quite filled. It was the cold of scorn, the way the other villagers' eyes would slide past her, refusing to acknowledge her existence. And it was the cold of the brand. She flexed her fingers, the rough wool of her mitten scratching her skin. Even through the thick fabric, she could feel the phantom shape of it on her left wrist. A small, ugly circle of scarred flesh, the mark of the disgraced. The mark of her father, a traitor executed a decade ago. A mark she was forced to bear. They called her the Branded. It was not a name, but a sentence. Her job was to collect wood from the forest's edge, a task no one else wanted in the deepening winter. The wind sliced through the thin fabric of her coat, each gust a fresh betrayal. The trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their bare branches clawing at a sky the color of old iron. A flicker of movement near the base of a great pine caught her eye. A small snow hare, its leg caught in a poacher's forgotten snare. Its frantic struggles had only tightened the wire. Alara's own misery was a vast gray ocean, but seeing the creature's panic was a sharp, piercing island in its midst. She knew what it was to be trapped. She knelt in the snow, her knees instantly soaking and beginning to burn with cold. "Hush now," she whispered, her voice a plume of white in the frigid air. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled with the wire. It was tight, biting into the hare's fragile leg. She winced in sympathy, her own brand tingling as if in response. With a final, determined twist, the wire sprang free. The hare, terrified and liberated, shot away into the undergrowth, a flash of white against the dirty snow. Alara didn't expect thanks. She never did. She just watched it go, a strange hollow ache in her chest. It was free. She was not. As she rose, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom of the forest. It was massive, silent, and the color of midnight. For a heart-stopping second she thought it was a bear. But then she saw the eyes. They were not the flat, black beads of a bear. They were intelligent, ancient, and they glowed with a faint internal light, like embers in a dying fire. Fen, the werewolf. Every child in the north knew the stories. The Alpha King's shadow, the last of a giant breed of dire wolves, a companion so loyal it was said to be an extension of the king's own will. For 12 years, since the great tragedy that had claimed the royal family, the wolf had been a permanent fixture at the foot of the obsidian throne, a silent, living monument to the king's grief and power. It never left his side. Yet here it was, in Blackwood, watching her. Fear was a useless luxury. She had learned that long ago. She simply met the wolf's gaze, her heart a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She was just a branded girl, less than nothing. The beast would pass her by as all others did. But it didn't. It took a step forward, then another. Its paws made no sound on the snow. It was as large as a pony, its shoulders rippling with muscle beneath a thick, dark pelt. It stopped a few feet from her, its head cocked, those intelligent eyes studying her with an unnerving intensity. It was not aggression she saw in its gaze. It was curiosity. The great wolf lowered its head and sniffed at the spot where the hare had been snared. It then looked back at her, a low rumble starting deep in its chest. It wasn't a growl of menace. It sounded more like a question. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and melted back into the trees, leaving only its footprints and a profound silence in its wake. Alara stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. The Alpha King's wolf. Here. Why? The question echoed in the empty spaces of her mind as she gathered her wood, her hands trembling for a reason that had nothing to do with the cold. The rumors had been swirling for a week. The Alpha King himself was coming to Blackwood. An inspection. A show of force to the restless territories on the border. For the villagers, it was a source of terror and excitement. For Ilara, it was just another reason to make herself smaller, more invisible. A man that powerful would have no time for the dregs of his kingdom. The storm hit the day he was due to arrive. It was not a normal winter storm. It was a living thing, a ravenous beast of wind and snow that clawed at the walls of the village and screamed through the narrow streets. The sky and the earth became one, a roiling chaos of white. Alara had been sent to the widow Hestra's cabin at the edge of the village, delivering a meager portion of firewood. The old woman was blind and would have frozen without it. It was a duty Alara had taken upon herself, another small act of kindness in a world that had shown her none. By the time she started back, the storm had descended in full fury. The path was gone, swallowed by the blizzard. Every direction was the same disorienting wall of white. The wind was a physical force, shoving and pulling at her, stealing the breath from her lungs. The cold, her old companion, was no longer just a chill, it was a predator. It sank its teeth into her, a deep, biting pain that turned to a creeping numbness. Her feet were blocks of ice. Her hands, even in their mittens, were useless claws. She fell. The snow was surprisingly soft, like a bed. A peaceful, final bed. Her body screamed for her to stay down, to let the quiet white take her. It would be so easy. A flicker of defiance, the last ember of her spirit fought back. She would not die here. Not like this. She struggled to her feet, stumbling forward, blind. She didn't know how long she walked. Minutes became an eternity. The world narrowed to the rasp of her own breathing and the shrieking of the wind. Then her legs gave out for the last time. She crumpled into a snowdrift, the last of her strength gone. The fight was over. The cold was winning. A strange peace settled over her. She closed her eyes. At least it would be quiet. A shadow fell over her. She managed to pry her eyelids open. The world was a blur, but she could make out a shape, impossibly large, standing over her. It was him, the wolf. Fen. And beside the wolf, a man. He was a figure from a legend, carved from the storm itself. Taller and broader than any man she had ever seen, wrapped in dark furs dusted with snow. His hair was the color of a winter night, and his face was all sharp angles and harsh beauty, like a mountain peak. He looked as cold and merciless as the wilderness that had forged him. The Alpha King, Kalin. His eyes, the color of ice, found hers. For a moment the world stopped. The roaring wind faded to a whisper. In his gaze, she saw not the contempt or disgust she expected, but a flash of something else. Shock. Recognition. An emotion so fierce and raw it stole the last of her breath. He knelt beside her, his movements economical and powerful. The town's alderman and his guards were behind him, shouting to be heard over the wind, their faces masks of terror and awe. The king ignored them completely. His focus was entirely on her. "I'll take this one." His voice was deep, resonant, a command that cut through the storm's fury. It was not a suggestion, it was a statement of fact. Before she could process the words, before her frozen mind could even form a question, his arms were around her. She expected his touch to be as cold as the ice in his eyes. She was wrong. An impossible warmth bloomed where he touched her. It was not the heat of a fire, but something deeper. A vital, living energy that seeped through her frozen clothes and into her very core. It was like the first ray of sun after a century of winter. It chased away the killing cold, sparking a flicker of life in her dying limbs. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. She was pressed against the hard wall of his chest, surrounded by the scent of pine, snow, and something else. Something uniquely him. A scent of power and loneliness and ancient stone. The alderman sputtered, gesturing to the brand on her wrist, visible where her mitten had fallen off. Your Majesty, she is a branded, unclean, not fit. Kalen didn't even look at him. His gaze was fixed on Alara's pale face. I was addressing my future queen, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. The words hung in the air, freezing the alderman's protests on his lips. Future queen. The words were madness, a fever dream. Alara's head swam. The shock, the cold, the sudden, impossible warmth. It was too much. Her world tilted and went dark, but the last thing she was aware of was the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her ear, and the feeling of being, for the first time in her life, utterly and completely safe. Warmth. That was the first thing she registered. A deep, pervasive warmth that soaked into her bones and thawed the ice that had lived there for a decade. She was lying in a bed, a real bed, piled high with furs that were softer than anything she had ever touched. A fire crackled in a stone hearth nearby, its light dancing on the timbered walls. The air smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. She was alive. Her eyes fluttered open. She was in a large, rustic chamber, clearly the best room the Blackwood Inn had to offer. Her ragged, wet clothes were gone, replaced by a simple, clean linen shift. On a chair by the fire, her old coat and mittens had been laid out to dry, a small, pathetic testament to the life she had almost left behind. A heavy tread on the floorboards made her stiffen. The king entered from an adjoining room. He had shed his outer furs and wore a simple black tunic that did nothing to hide the immense power in his shoulders and arms. He moved with a predator's grace, a silent, contained force that made the very air in the room feel heavy. He carried a wooden tray. On it was a bowl of steaming stew, a hunk of dark bread, and a mug of what smelled like mulled cider. He set it on the small table beside her bed without a word. His silence was a wall. His face was a mask of cold control, the harsh planes and angles revealing nothing. The man who had spoken of queens in the blizzard was gone, replaced by this remote, untouchable monarch. Had she dreamed it? You are awake, he stated. It wasn't a question. She struggled to sit up, her muscles aching. Your Majesty. The words were a croak. Her throat was raw. He pushed the tray closer. Eat. It was another command. She looked from the food to his impassive face. Fear and confusion warred inside her. Why was she here? What did he want with a branded outcast? The villagers would be whispering, speculating. This was a violation of the natural order of things. Why? The question slipped out. Barely a whisper. His eyes, those piercing chips of ice, met hers. For a fraction of a second, she saw a flicker of that same raw emotion from the storm. A deep, unsettling turmoil he was trying desperately to contain. You will return with me to the capital, he said, ignoring her question. You will be given chambers in the citadel. You will want for nothing. Her heart hammered against her ribs. But I am a branded. My father. I am aware of who your father was. He cut her off, his voice flat. That is irrelevant. You are now a ward of the crown. Your past is a closed book. He was erasing her history, her shame, with a few clipped words. It should have felt like liberation. Instead, it felt like being put in a new, more gilded cage. This is not a reward, he continued, his tone hardening as if he were arguing with himself. This is a matter of state. A necessity. Do you understand? She didn't. Not at all. But she nodded because what else could she do? Argue with the Alpha King? The man who held the life of every person in the North in his hands. There will be rules, he said, pacing the length of the room like a caged wolf. You will have your own wing. You are not to enter my private quarters. This is an arrangement of convenience. It is not personal. Every word was a brick in the wall he was building between them. He was setting boundaries, drawing lines in the stone floor. He would not love her. He would not even know her. This was duty, a strange, incomprehensible duty. I understand, Your Majesty, she murmured, her gaze dropping to the stew. Her stomach growled, a vulgar, embarrassing sound in the tense silence. A ghost of something, annoyance, amusement, flitted across his lips. Eat, he said again, his voice a fraction softer this time. She obeyed, lifting the spoon with a trembling hand. The stew was rich with meat and root vegetables, the most decadent thing she had ever tasted. Each spoonful was a small miracle of warmth and flavor. She ate with the quiet desperation of the chronically starved, trying not to shame herself. When she was done, he took the tray. Their fingers brushed. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. The same impossible warmth she had felt in the storm, but 100 times more potent. It was pure energy, a shock to her system that made her gasp. He flinched back as if burned, his mask cracking. She saw it then, clear as day. Shock, fear, and a terrifying, naked longing. He felt it too. He straightened abruptly, his face once more an unreadable mask of stone. But it was too late. She had seen behind the wall. She had seen the turmoil he was trying so desperately to hide. He left the room without another word, closing the door firmly behind him. Alara stared at the closed door, her hand tingling. This was no arrangement of convenience. This was something else entirely. Something dangerous and volatile and utterly terrifying. Later that night, unable to sleep, she heard a soft scratching at her door. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it him? Had he come back? She crept to the door and eased it open a crack. Lying on the cold stone floor of the hallway was Fen, the great werewolf, who for 12 years had guarded the foot of the obsidian throne, had abandoned his post. He lifted his massive head, his ember-like eyes meeting hers. He gave a low, contented rumble and rested his head back on his paws. He was guarding her door. Alara closed the door, her back pressing against the rough wood. Her mind reeled. The king's words were a lie, a defense against something he couldn't control. His wolf knew the truth. The journey to the capital was a blur of snow-covered landscapes and tense, silent evenings. They traveled in the king's private carriage, a fortress of dark wood and fur on wheels. He sat opposite her, a formidable, brooding presence who rarely spoke. He would stare out the window for hours, his jaw tight, lost in a landscape of memory she could not see. But the intimacy he denied with words crept in through other avenues. He made sure the carriage was always warm, that the furs were tucked around her. When they stopped at coaching inns, the best rooms were always prepared, the finest food brought to her. He watched her eat, a hawk-like intensity in his gaze, as if her sustenance was a matter of vital importance. And every night, without fail, Fen would leave the king's side and curl up outside her door. It became a silent nightly ritual, a testament to a bond the king refused to acknowledge. The guards whispered. The servants stared. The Alpha King's shadow had chosen a new post. The capital, Skolheim, was a city carved from the heart of a mountain, a breathtaking and intimidating fortress of black granite and ice. The citadel rose from its center like a jagged spear, touching the clouds. This was the heart of his power, the center of his cold, lonely world. Her promised chambers were not mere rooms. They were a suite of apartments in the Queen's Wing, a section of the citadel that had been sealed for 12 years. Since the fire, since the tragedy that had taken his parents and his sister, leaving him the sole survivor, the reluctant king. The air was thick with disuse, the furniture shrouded in white cloths like ghosts. Servants scurried ahead of them, pulling off the sheets, opening shutters to let in the pale winter light. It was a beautiful prison, filled with the echoes of a family he had lost. He stood in the doorway of the main sitting room, his massive frame seeming to shrink the space. "This will be yours," he said, his voice hollow. "You will be safe here." She looked at the portraits on the wall, their faces obscured by dust. A beautiful woman with his ice-blue eyes, a stern-faced man with his dark hair, a young girl with a mischievous smile, his family. She felt it then, not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. A wave of grief so profound, so vast and cold it threatened to drown her. It poured off him in waves, a suffocating, endless winter of the soul. This was his secret. The source of the cold he wrapped himself in like a shroud. He wasn't just a king. He was a mourner, the last of his line. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words pulled from her by the sheer force of his pain. His head snapped up, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment the mask was gone. She saw not the king, but the boy he must have been, left alone in the ashes of his world. She saw the crushing weight of the crown, the unbearable loneliness of the throne. "Do not pity me," he snarled, the words a desperate defense. The walls slammed back into place. The king returned. He turned and strode away, his boots echoing on the marble floors, leaving her alone with his ghosts. That night, lying in the enormous cold bed, she felt the truth of their arrangement. He hadn't brought her here for convenience. He had brought her here because the strange warmth that sparked between them was the only thing that could fight the desolate cold inside him. He was a man freezing to death, and she was an inexplicable fire he had stumbled upon in the wilderness. He was terrified of being burned. She was terrified of being extinguished. And outside her door, the great wolf Fen lay sentinel, guarding the flicker of hope in the heart of the king's long winter. The court was a viper's nest of whispers and sidelong glances. Ilara, the branded girl from the wilderness, was a curiosity, a scandal, a threat. The nobles, clad in their fine silks and furs, looked at her with a mixture of fear and contempt. They saw her plain wool dresses, the ghost of the brand on her wrist that no amount of soap could scrub away, and they saw an intruder. Kalen did little to quell the rumors. He maintained his public distance, treating her with a formal, chilling courtesy that only fueled the speculation. But in private, the boundaries he had so fiercely established were eroding, crumbling like sandcastles against a rising tide. He would appear in her rooms late at night, under the pretext of discussing some minor household matter. But the discussions would trail off, and he would simply stand by the fire, watching her, the silence between them thick with unspoken things. He started bringing her gifts, a book of old legends, a shawl of impossibly soft wool, a single, perfect winter rose found in the Citadel's heated conservatory. Small gestures that felt monumental. One evening he arrived with a cut on his forearm, a long, shallow gash from a training spar. He dismissed it as nothing, but she saw the way it bled sluggishly, the way his skin around it was pale and cold. "Let me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He froze, watching her as she retrieved a basin of warm water and clean linen from her bathing chamber. She motioned for him to sit. After a moment of hesitation that felt like a battle of wills, he obeyed, sinking into a chair by the fire. She knelt before him, taking his powerful arm in her hands. Her touch was gentle. He flinched, not from pain, but from the contact. The warmth that always sparked between them flared, and she felt it travel up her arms, a pleasant, tingling heat. As she cleaned the wound, she noticed something strange. The flesh, which should have been warm with blood, was cool to the touch. Not icy, but lacking the vital heat of a healthy body. It was as if the long winter of his grief had physically settled into him. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly, dabbing at the edges of the cut. "No," he grunted. "Liar," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She could feel the pain radiating from him, not just from the cut, but from a deeper, older wound. She finished binding the wound, her fingers lingering on his skin for a fraction of a second too long. He didn't pull away. His gaze was fixed on her face, his expression raw and vulnerable in the flickering firelight. "Why you?" he murmured, the question a ragged sigh. It was the question that haunted them both. "I don't know," she answered honestly. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was feather light, yet it sent a tremor through her entire body. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness from this hard, cold man that it shattered a piece of the wall around her own heart. Just as the moment stretched into something new, something that could not be taken back, the doors to her chambers were thrown open. "Your Majesty." The voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with steel. A man stood in the doorway, tall and silver-haired, his robes of office impeccable. He had a scholar's face, but his eyes were the cold, watchful eyes of a hawk. He was flanked by two of the king's personal guard. Kalen snatched his hand back as if he had touched a hot iron, his entire posture shifting. The cold mask slammed down, the king returning in an instant. He rose to his full, intimidating height. "Lord Valerius," Kalen said, his voice flat and devoid of welcome. "You are a long way from the council chambers." Lord Valerius's gaze flickered to Alara, kneeling on the floor, and then to the bandage on the king's arm. His lips thinned into a disapproving line. He had been the old king's most trusted advisor, the man who had guided the realm through the dark days after the great tragedy. He was the architect of Kalen's reign, and he viewed the king's power as his own creation. "There are urgent matters, my king," Valerius said, his tone implying that this dalliance was not one of them. "The border lords are restless. A delegation has arrived. They demand an audience." He paused, letting his words sink in. "They question the stability of the throne. They speak of distractions." The barb was aimed at Alara, and it hit its mark. She felt the heat of a blush creep up her neck. She was the distraction, the branded girl who had somehow bewitched the cold, untouchable king. Kalen's jaw tightened. "I will meet with them in the morning." "As you wish, Your Majesty," Valerius said, bowing slightly. But his eyes were on Ilara, and they were filled with a chilling, possessive animosity. He saw her not as a person, but as a flaw in his perfect design, a variable he could not control. Perhaps it would be wise for the girl to remain in her chambers. The court is unsettled. Her presence might provoke them further. It was a threat veiled as a suggestion. Before Kalen could reply, Alara found her voice. "I am not a girl," she said, rising to her feet with a dignity she didn't know she possessed. "And I am not afraid of your court, my lord." Valerius's eyes narrowed. He had expected a frightened waif, not this quiet defiance. Kalen looked at her, a flicker of something. Pride? Surprise? In his icy eyes. He had seen her strength, the resilience that had allowed her to survive in Blackwood. "She will attend the evening meal in the Great Hall with me," Kalen declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. It was a direct challenge to Valerius, a public claim. See to it. Lord Valerius's face was a mask of cold fury, but he bowed again. "As the king commands." He turned and swept from the room, his guards trailing in his wake like shadows. The air in the room was thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. The fragile intimacy of their moment was shattered. "He hates me," Alara stated quietly. "He fears what he cannot control," Kalen corrected, his gaze distant. "He has guided this kingdom for 12 years. He forgets who wears the crown. But Alara knew it was more than that. Valerius hadn't looked at her with political calculation. He had looked at her with personal hatred. He saw her as a contamination of the king's grief, a grief Valerius seemed to cherish and protect, as if it were a sacred flame. The next few weeks were a cold war fought in the corridors and halls of the citadel. Valerius moved against her with subtle, vicious precision. A gown delivered to her chambers would be the wrong color, one reserved for mourning, a silent mockery of her presence. Whispers would follow her through the halls, lies about her past, her parentage, her supposed witchcraft. He was isolating her, trying to drive her out with 1,000 small cuts. Kaelin fought back in his own way. He made a point of sitting with her in the gardens, of requesting her presence at council meetings, much to Valerius's barely concealed rage. His public defense of her only hardened the lines, splitting the court into factions, those loyal to the memory of the old ways, represented by Valerius, and those drawn to the new, strange warmth that seemed to emanate from the throne whenever Alara was near. The threat escalated during the annual winter hunt. It was a brutal, ancient tradition. The nobles and their retinues would ride into the King's Wood, a vast tamed forest near the citadel. Valerius insisted that Alara, as a ward of the crown, must attend. It was presented as an honor. She knew it was a trap. She was given a placid mare, but as the hunting party galloped through a narrow gorge, something spooked her horse. A sharp noise, like a rock deliberately thrown from the cliffs above. The mare reared, screaming, its eyes wide with terror. Alara, an inexperienced rider, was thrown. She landed hard, the impact knocking the wind from her. Her head struck a rock, and the world dissolved into a constellation of bright, painful stars. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the thunder of hooves. The rest of the hunt was charging through the gorge, blinded by the thrill of the chase. They hadn't seen her fall. She was about to be trampled. A furious roar, more beast than man, cut through the chaos. Kaelin. He was on his massive black warhorse, his face a terrifying mask of pure rage. He wrenched his mount around, placing himself between her and the oncoming riders, his own body a shield. Halt! The command was a physical force, stopping the entire hunting party in its tracks. The nobles reined in their horses, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Kaelin leaped from his horse before it had even stopped moving. He was at her side in 3 long strides, his eyes wild. He knelt, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, afraid of the damage he might find. "Are you hurt?" The question was a low, guttural growl, laced with a panic he could not hide. I don't think so," she managed, her head throbbing. His eyes scanned her, cataloging every possible injury. His gaze fell upon a scrape on her temple, where a trickle of blood ran down into her hair. His control snapped. He rose to his feet and turned to face the stunned nobles. His eyes glowed with a faint molten gold light, a sign of his wolf blood rising to the surface. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice a low thunder that rolled through the gorge. Silence. No one dared to speak. From the back of the party, Lord Valerius watched, his face impassive, but Alara could see the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. This was his doing. He had wanted to frighten her, to show her she was vulnerable. But he had miscalculated. He had not anticipated the sheer ferocity of the king's reaction. Kaelin's gaze swept the cliffs above. "The hunt is over," he announced, his voice ringing with cold fury. "Return to the citadel, now." He didn't wait for them to obey. He turned back to Alara, scooping her into his arms as he had in the storm. He carried her to his own horse, mounting with a fluid grace that belied his size and her weight. He settled her in front of him, one arm a steel band around her waist, holding her close against his chest. She could feel the furious pounding of his heart, the tremor of rage that ran through his body. He was a storm contained, a blizzard about to break. He had hidden his feelings for her behind a wall of duty and protocol, but the threat to her life had shattered it completely. In front of his entire court, he had shown his hand. He had chosen her. And in doing so, he had declared war on anyone who wished her harm. As they rode back to the citadel, leaving the stunned court behind, Ilara leaned her head back against his shoulder. The throbbing in her head subsided, replaced by the steady, comforting rhythm of his presence. She was no longer just a branded girl. She was the king's choice, and that made her the most dangerous woman in the kingdom. The aftermath of the hunt was a tense, brittle silence. Lord Valerius was publicly chastised for his lack of oversight, a humiliation that only deepened the lines of hatred on his face. He became more withdrawn, more serpentine, his whispers in the court turning from simple gossip to dark poison. He painted Ilara as a sorceress who had ensnared the king, a blight on the memory of the true queen, Kaelin's mother. He was planting seeds of sedition, watering them with fear. Kaelin, for his part, abandoned all pretense of distance. The wall between them was gone, razed to the ground by his fear for her. He spent his days ruling the kingdom and his nights with her. Not as a lover, a line he still seemed terrified to cross, but as a confidant, a companion. He would read to her from old texts, his deep voice a soothing rumble in the quiet of her rooms. He told her stories of his childhood, of the sister he had adored, the parents he had revered. He was showing her the hollow spaces in his heart, the wounds that had never healed. In turn, she told him of her life in Blackwood, the small kindnesses and the grand cruelties, the constant, gnawing cold. She spoke of her father not as the traitor the kingdom knew, but as the man she vaguely remembered, a man who smelled of sawdust and sang her to sleep. One night, as a fresh blizzard raged outside the citadel walls, he sat by her fire, staring into the flames. The cold was back in him, a palpable aura of grief that chilled the room. "It was a night like this," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "The fire. They said it was an accident. But the cold came first." She went to him, kneeling by his chair as she had done on that first night when she'd bandaged his arm. She placed her hand on his, not to give comfort, but simply to share the weight of his sorrow. The warmth that always sparked between them flared. But this time, something was different. As her warmth touched him, the deep, unnatural cold that clung to him seemed to recoil. For a moment, the tension in his shoulders eased. The haunted look in his eyes lessened. He looked at their joined hands, then at her face, a dawning wonder in his expression. "How do you do that?" he whispered. "Do what?" "You make it quiet," he said, struggling for the words. "The cold, the memories. When you are near, they don't scream so loudly." It was the most profound confession he could have made. He needed her. Not just as a king needs a queen, but as a dying man needs medicine. Her very presence was an antidote to the poison that had been killing him slowly for 12 years. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating. This was the source of her power over him, the reason for the inexplicable pull. Her soul was the counterpoint to his. Her light, the answer to his darkness. This revelation, this fragile new beginning, was what Valerius had to destroy. The blow fell 3 days later. A feast was held to celebrate the winter solstice. The great hall was filled with nobles, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. Kaelin sat on the obsidian throne, Ilara in the seat of honor beside him, the queen's seat, though she did not yet wear the crown. Valerius proposed a toast. He raised his silver goblet, his eyes glittering in the torchlight. "To the king," he said, his voice ringing with false sincerity, "and to the memory of his noble family, whose light we shall never see again." It was a pointed reminder, a jab at the woman sitting where the queen should be. Kalen's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head and drank from his own goblet. It was a ceremonial gesture, one he could not refuse without causing a political incident. An hour later, in the midst of the revelry, Kalen swayed in his seat. Alara saw it first. A slight tremor in his hand. A sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the coolness of the hall. "Kalen," she whispered, touching his arm. His skin was like ice. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. A faint blue tinge was appearing around his lips. "The wine," he rasped, his voice a fraction of its normal strength. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. He collapsed, not with a crash, but with a slow, dreadful slide from the throne. He fell to the stone floor, his body convulsing. The hall erupted in chaos. Women screamed. Guards drew their swords, unsure of who or what to fight. Alara was by his side in an instant, pushing through the panicked crowd. She knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap. The cold pouring off him was terrifying. It was not the chill of a winter night. It was an unnatural, soul-deep frost, a living entity that was consuming him from the inside out. Frost was beginning to spiderweb across his black tunic from where his heart lay beneath. "The healers!" someone shouted. "Get the royal physicians!" But it was Lord Valerius who took control. He stepped forward, his face a mask of grim authority. "Stand back," he commanded. "This is dark magic. The king is cursed." His eyes, burning with triumphant malice, found Alara. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at her. "She did this," he roared, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. "The branded witch. She has poisoned him with her dark arts to seize the throne. I saw her put something in his cup." The accusation hung in the air, sickening and plausible to the terrified nobles. She was the outsider, the anomaly. It was easier to blame her than to face the reality of a traitor in their midst. The crowd recoiled from her, their faces turning from fear to hatred. "Seize her!" Valerius commanded the guards. The guards hesitated, their loyalty torn between the king's chosen and his most trusted advisor. But before they could move, a guttural roar shook the very stones of the great hall. Fen, the great wolf, launched himself from the shadows near the throne. He landed between Alara and the advancing guards, a black-furred wall of fury. His lips were curled back, revealing teeth like daggers. A low, menacing growl promised death to anyone who took another step. He was guarding them both now, the dying king and the woman accused of his murder. Valerius's plan had been perfect. He had used an ancient, untraceable poison, one that mimicked the soul sickness that had haunted the royal line for generations. A poison that didn't just kill the body, but extinguish the spirit. The healers would be useless. By dawn, the king would be dead, and the branded girl would be blamed, tried, and executed. The throne would be empty, the kingdom in chaos, and he, Lord Valerius, the grieving, loyal advisor, would be the only one strong enough to step in and restore order. He had not accounted for the wolf, and he had not accounted for Alara. She ignored the shouts, the accusations, the drawn steel. Her entire world had narrowed to the man dying in her arms. Kalen's breathing was shallow, each exhale a cloud of white vapor in the warm hall. The frost on his chest was spreading. His skin was turning a deathly shade of blue-gray. He was freezing from the inside out. "Kalen," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Don't leave me, please. Don't leave me alone." His icy eyes, barely open, found hers. He was trying to speak, to warn her, to tell her to run. But no sound came out. A single frozen tear traced a path down his cheek. Despair washed over her, a cold tide that mirrored the frost consuming him. She was going to lose him. The one person who had ever seen her, who had ever made her feel warm, was being stolen from her. And then, despair gave way to something else. Rage. a white-hot, furious rage at Valerius, at the court that had scorned her, at the cruel fate that would give her a glimpse of hope only to snatch it away. She would not let him die. She refused. "No," she whispered, the word a vow. She pressed her hands to his chest, right over the spreading ice. She closed her eyes and thought of the warmth, the spark that jumped between them, the feeling of the sun on her face after a long winter, the impossible, vital heat she had felt when he first lifted her from the snow. She didn't know how, but she knew that warmth was hers. It was a part of her she had never understood, a light she had kept hidden even from herself. She reached for it now, deep inside her soul. She gathered every bit of hope, every moment of kindness, every flicker of love she felt for this broken, beautiful man. She poured all of it, her entire being, her very life force, into her hands. She chose to die for him, if that's what it took. And the power that had been dormant inside her for 19 years answered. It was not a flicker. It was an eruption. A brilliant golden light exploded from her hands. It was not the harsh light of a fire, but the pure, gentle, and overwhelmingly powerful light of a sunrise. It flooded the great hall, pushing back the shadows, silencing the crowd. The light was pure warmth, pure life. It poured from her into Kalen's frozen body, a torrent of liquid sunshine. The ice on his chest sizzled and vanished. The blue tinge of his skin receded, replaced by a healthy, living flush. The light met the poison, the ancient cold, and it did not just fight it. It annihilated it. On her left wrist, the ugly, scarred brand of her past began to glow. The light grew brighter and brighter until, with a sound like shattering glass, the scar tissue dissolved, burned away not by heat, but by purity. In its place, her skin was flawless, unmarked, and glowing with a soft, residual light. She was no longer branded. She was remade. The effort was monumental. She felt her own life force draining away, feeding the inferno that was saving him. The world began to gray at the edges. But she didn't stop. She held on, a lifeline in a frozen sea, until she felt a new strength surge beneath her palms. A steady, powerful heartbeat. His heartbeat. The light receded, coalescing back into her. She slumped forward, her strength utterly spent, her head resting on his now warm chest. The hall was silent, the only sound the crackling of the torches and the ragged gasps of the stunned onlookers. Lord Valerius stared, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. His perfect plan had been shattered by a power he could not comprehend. The witch he had tried to create had become a saint before his very eyes. Then, a hand, strong and warm, covered hers on his chest. Kalen's eyes opened. The ice was gone. They were clear, vibrant, and filled with a love so profound it took her breath away. He was alive. The silence in the great hall was absolute, a thick blanket of awe and fear. Everyone had seen it. The branded girl, the witch, had bathed the room in holy light and brought the king back from the brink of death. She knelt over him, exhausted but radiant, her hand still resting over his heart. Kalen's hand tightened over hers, a silent, possessive anchor. He drew a deep, shuddering breath, the first clean breath he had taken in 12 years. The internal cold, the constant companion of his grief, was gone. It had been scoured away, not just by her light, but by the poison's terrible passage. The ancient sickness of his bloodline had been burned out, and in its place, there was only the warmth she had poured into him. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and he saw everything. He saw the resilience that had kept her alive in Blackwood. He saw the kindness that had made her save a snared rabbit when she had nothing. He saw the love that had made her refuse to let him go, a love so powerful it had bent reality. This was no accident. This was destiny. He had been searching for a cure for his kingdom, for his soul, and he had found it in a snowdrift, in the form of a half-frozen girl who carried the sun inside her. His gaze shifted from her face, sweeping over the stunned court. It was the gaze of a king reborn, sharp and absolute. His eyes found Lord Valerius. The advisor was trying to shrink back into the crowd, his face ashen. The hunter had become the prey. "Guards!" Kalen's voice rang out, no longer hollow with grief, but filled with a new, resonant power. "Seize him." This time, the guards did not hesitate. They converged on Valerius, who crumpled without a fight, his serpentine cunning collapsing into pathetic fear. "Treason is not a charge I use lightly, Valerius," Kalen said, his voice dangerously soft as the guards hauled the man before the throne. "But you have conspired against the crown, you have attempted to murder your king, and you have dared to threaten the life of my queen." My queen. He said the words with such certainty, such finality, that they settled over the hall like a coronation. He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating a fact. With Alara's help, he rose to his feet. He was weak, but his stance was unwavering. He stood before the court, not as the cold, remote monarch they had known, but as a man who had been to the edge of death and returned. He kept Alara at his side, his arms securely around her waist, a public, undeniable claim. "Let this be known," he declared, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "Ilara of Blackwood is my chosen mate, my partner, the light of my soul. Her word is my word. Her safety is the safety of the realm. Anyone who objects can take their concerns to my dungeons." He looked down at her, his icy eyes now the color of a warm summer sky. The love in them was a tangible force, a promise of 1,000 sunrises. He cupped her face, his thumb gently tracing the spot on her wrist where the brand had been. It was smooth, perfect, and faintly warm to the touch. "You saved me," he whispered, for her ears only. "You saw me," she whispered back, her own heart overflowing. He hadn't just saved her from the cold. He had seen the person beneath the brand, the worth she had never believed she possessed. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a king claiming his prize. It was a man worshipping his savior. It was tender and fierce, a release of all the pent-up longing, the fear, the desperation. It was the taste of wood smoke and winter and the promise of spring. In that kiss, two broken halves became whole. The court, the guards, the traitor. They all faded away. There was only the two of them, a circle of light and warmth in a cold, dark world. When he finally broke the kiss, he rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling. "Mine," he murmured, the word not a command, but a prayer. "Yours," she answered, her self-doubt finally washed away by the tide of his love and her own newfound power. She was not worthless. She was not invisible. She was a queen. Fen, the great wolf, padded silently to their side. He sat at Alara's feet, resting his massive head on her boots. He looked up at them, his ancient, ember-like eyes full of a wisdom that seemed to say, "At last." The king's shadow now guarded the queen's light, and the throne was finally, truly secure. 6 months later, spring had come to Skolheim. The snows had melted from the mountain peaks, and the valleys were bursting with green. The change in season was mirrored in the kingdom itself. The oppressive chill of Kalen's long grief had been replaced by a new warmth, a new hope that emanated from the throne. Alara, now Queen Alara, stood on a balcony overlooking the city. The plain wool of her past had been replaced by simple but elegant gowns of deep blue and forest green, but she had refused the ostentatious jewels the court treasury offered. Her only adornment was the soft internal light that sometimes seemed to glow from her skin when she was happy, which was most of the time. The whispers in court had not vanished entirely, but they had changed. They were no longer whispers of scorn, but of awe. They called her the Sun Queen, the Light Bringer. Mothers brought their sick children to the castle gates, not for the royal physicians, but in the hope that a glance from the queen might bring a healing warmth. Often it did. Her power was not a weapon, but a balm, and she used it with the same quiet kindness she had once used to free a snared rabbit. Lord Valerius was gone, exiled to the farthest, most desolate corner of the kingdom, stripped of his titles and his power. His betrayal had been a cancer, and its removal had allowed the kingdom to begin healing. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar, beloved scent of pine and winter filled her senses. Kalen rested his chin on her shoulder, his body a solid, comforting presence against her back. "What is my queen plotting?" he rumbled, his voice still a marvel to her. It had lost its harsh, brittle edge and was now a deep, warm current she could listen to for hours. "Plotting the new hospital wing," she replied, leaning back into his embrace. "And wondering if you will ever learn to enter a room quietly." He chuckled, the sound a rich vibration against her spine. "I am a wolf, my love. We are not known for our subtlety." She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel his heart, strong and steady beneath her palm. It was a constant source of wonder to her, this living, breathing warmth where there had once been only ice. "The delegates from the southern reach arrived today," he said, his expression turning more serious. "They are wary. They heard stories of a branded witch and a dying king." "Then let them meet a living king and his happy wife," she said, her confidence no longer a fragile new thing, but a deep, rooted certainty. "Let them see that winter is over." He smiled, a true, breathtaking smile that still had the power to make her heart skip a beat. It was like sunrise after a month of rain. "Winter is over," he agreed, his voice soft. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, everyday kiss that spoke of shared mornings and peaceful nights. It was a kiss that held more power than any royal decree. Later that day, she stood beside him in the great hall as the Southern delegates were presented. They were proud, stern-faced men and women, their colorful silks a stark contrast to the North's somber furs. Their eyes were skeptical, their postures rigid. They were expecting to find a kingdom in thrall to dark magic. Kalen greeted them with his newfound warmth, but it was Alara they watched. She simply stood beside her husband, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a serene smile on her face. She did not need to display her power. It was there in the way the king deferred to her, in the way Fen lay peacefully at her feet, in the very air of the court, which was no longer charged with fear, but with loyalty and respect. During a lull in the proceedings, the matriarch of the Southern delegation, a shrewd old woman with eyes that missed nothing, approached Alara. "They say you carry the sun inside you, Your Majesty," the woman said, her voice dry as desert sand. Alara smiled. "The sun belongs to everyone," she replied. "I was just cold for a very long time. My husband helped me find my warmth." The matriarch studied her for a long moment, then her stern face broke into a craggy smile. "I believe the South and the North will have much to talk about," she said, and bowed her head in a gesture of genuine respect. That night, as the moon cast a silver glow over the mountain peaks, Ilara and Kalen walked in the castle gardens. Fen trotted ahead of them, his great form a moving piece of the night. "You won them over without a single flash of light," Kalen observed, taking her hand. "They didn't need to see the light," she said. "They needed to see that you were whole, that we are whole." He stopped, turning her to face him. He looked at her, his love a palpable presence in the quiet garden. He was no longer the haunted king, and she was no longer the broken girl. They had met in the heart of a storm, two souls lost in their own private winters, and together they had found their way to spring. "I love you, Alara," he said, the words as natural and as necessary as breathing, "and it will not kill me." "I know," she said, her heart full to bursting. "It will be the thing that saves us all." He pulled her close, and as they stood together under the northern stars, surrounded by the promise of a new season, she knew she was finally home. The cold was gone, banished forever, and in its place was a love as vast and as enduring as the mountains themselves.